Hello and welcome to another conversation with New Kinship, where we have conversations on sexuality, belonging, ethnicity, and today really leaning into the gender side of the sexuality conversation. My name is David, and we have TJ and our special guest, Grace Thomas, here with us. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. It's really a joy.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you,
Yeah.
Grace. Maybe I'll start. Grace and I met I think in the past like 8 months or something.
October of
Maybe
last year.
6 months. Yeah, 6 months. Anyways, we
Yeah.
met at a Oriented to Love discussion kind of presentation group. So it was great to connect with Grace. Yeah, I had heard of Grace just in some of the circles that I was in, but it was actually the time we connected. So I was so happy to connect with Grace, to talk, to see, kind of hear a little bit about Grace's story. And I was happy when Grace accepted to come on. Yeah, you're most welcome, Grace. Thank you again. I've always been impressed by how much you can talk across difference, kind of your love for people, your desire to just care about connection. So yeah, you're most welcome.
It
Yeah.
really feels good when people are curious about the transgender experience. And I'm hoping that I also am expressing the same kind of curiosity. And that's my goal.
Yeah.
About the different experiences that all of us have. I'm really convinced that if we're able to understand what life looks like for the person in front of us, it really builds connection and understanding, even if we are living much different lives, to be able to understand and appreciate how the other person arrived at where they are. It's so important. It means so much.
Yeah.
So thank you for offering curiosity to me today.
Yeah. Most definitely.
I forgot that you guys met at OTL. I just signed up to go to an OTL dialogue this May.
Oh my
So
gosh, you're going
I'm
to
excited
about my
That's
preparation.
so incredible. What
I'm
an
excited.
experience you'll
Yeah,
have.
it's a good experience. Grace, when was your OTL? Did you like your original
Oh my
OTL?
gosh, it was October of 2022,
Oh,
I
okay. Yeah.
believe.
Huh?
Yeah,
Cool.
what a life-changing weekend.
Nice.
Yes, I've never felt so connected to people. And we're all there from places of difference, and yet it meant absolutely nothing as we were attempting to love each other and be vulnerable and open to each other. That's very powerful, very powerful.
Yeah. Agreed.
And if for those who don't know about OTL, we actually have a previous episode that we can link to in the show notes from TJ's joining in on one of the OTL dialogues. So feel free to check that out for
I
more.
also talked with the OTL's director. Yeah. So it'll be good. I recommend it again to anyone who hasn't participated. And I know she's often trying to find side B people because there's fewer of us in number than other kind of perspectives in the sexuality and gender conversation. So yeah. So anyways, if you're a side B especially, just consider maybe joining an OTL someday. So yeah.
But back to you,
back
Grace.
to Grace. Grace, we really wanted to at first hear your story, like hear some of your kind of how you moved in this experience around sexuality, but also maybe particularly around gender. Yeah. And for our listeners, Grace is a trans woman, and Grace has a long story about kind of how she's evolved, and she's gone through a lot of different like places and positions and experiences over the years. So yeah, I'm not sure where you'd like to start. I've heard a little bit of your story, but you're welcome to.
My story probably begins back in the late 90s when my middle child, my son, was outed to me as being gay. At that time, I was pastoring an Assemblies of God church. I spent 32 years pastoring Assemblies of God churches. And so we were given a very narrow framework as to how to respond to my son. Basically 4 words: being gay is sin. That was all we knew. That was the entire, there was no nuance to that conversation. And yet I had this longing and desire to show up for my son, to love him. And yet I wasn't sure what I was able to do, what God would even be willing to have me do. And so that began a long journey for me, way too long. I think my youngest child, my second son, came out as gay 7 years later. And so of my 3 children, 2 of them are gay. Both of them are married now, and one of them has 2 of my grandchildren. I live with him at this point. At the time, I was married to my wife, Cindy. I am still married to her, though we are separated at the moment and trying to figure out what that looks like for both of us. We remain very much involved in each other's lives, but not living under the same roof, not functioning as a married couple anymore, but probably as supportive friends. And then jointly wanting to raise and provide a secure connection for our grandchildren. When I first discovered that my sons were gay, I spent a lot of time trying to talk my oldest son out of it. That was my only frame of reference. And so for 3 years, I come at him as probably too light a term. I would come at him with various perspectives from Scripture that I had been taught, and all in an attempt to get him to acknowledge that, he was making a bad choice and he could make other choices. At one point, I reached the place of thinking, well, okay, maybe you can't do anything about this, but perhaps you could be celibate. That I didn't know the term side A, side B, not even sure if they'd been invented at that point. But that was an option that I offered to him. Not that that was anything he was thinking about at all. By this point, he had pretty much walked away from the church, from his faith. My youngest son doesn't claim a faith either. He would say he's agnostic, and both of them would directly attribute their current spiritual state to their understanding of God's rejection of them, that they unfortunately learned in our Assemblies of God household. So that launched me on my journey, try to figure out how do I connect with my son. I realized after 3 years, as I pretty much driven him away, and he would only reach out when he was desperately in need of something, that's not the relationship I wanted with him. And so I went back to the Scriptures and pored over them, and it was actually Romans 1 that gave me a lot of relief in this area, in the sense that I began to read the passage. I set my son kind of in my imagination next to the passage and just started comparing what the passage was saying with who my son was and how he was living his life. And it starts out with a lot of sexual misconduct, if you will, on the part of heterosexual people. And, okay, that's not my son. And then it morphs into a lot of same-sex activity that has kind of the feel of, orgy and out of control and indiscriminate and so on. And I'm saying, okay, that's not my son. And then it continues on through the passage talking about all kinds of different evils that flow out of kind of this progression away from God. And that's not my son. And so I'm looking at that passage and saying, okay, it says something, but it doesn't appear to have anything to do with my son and the way in which he's living his life. The only one connection is that there's this brief reference to same-sex sexual activity that doesn't at all look like the same-sex sexual activity that my son is having or wanting. And so we reached at that point what we would call our agnostic position of saying, we don't know. It says something. It's Paul is clearly upset about something, but my son does not resemble what Paul is describing in any shape, form, or fashion. So I'm not going to continue to blow up our relationship over something that I don't even see how it directly applies. And we lived in that space for 20 years. It allowed us to go to his wedding. It allowed us to engage fully in his life as much as he was willing to have us be a part.
Mm-hmm.
It basically became a non-conversation for 20 years.
Wow, it's a long time.
Didn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, that's good. We can navigate this now. They have their relationship with God. I know how I'm personally approaching this. And I truly was in a I don't know place. That was a genuinely, I wasn't just saying I don't know, but inside still holding to the former ethic that I had once held. I truly did not know. And then in 2016, I came out to myself as transgender. And I realized what I don't know is cruel. How did I let my children stay in this position? I mean, I'm supposedly the one who has connection with God. I'm the one who has studied the scriptures forwards and backwards. I love the Bible. And the best I can give them is I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about, okay, well, let me say that to myself. I don't know. And I realize I have to know. My relationship with God is at stake here. What did they expect of me? And I do use the they them pronouns for God, pulling that out of Genesis and the use of it there. And so it helps me kind of embrace the possibilities of gender divergence and of there are various expressions. Anyway, I diverged. I just realized that the last thing my sons had heard was God hates them. I know that's not the message. It's never been the message, but that's what they heard. They also are now hearing me say, I don't know. Essentially meaning, well, there's a 50-50 shot here. Maybe God's upset about this. Maybe he's not. And so are you willing to upend your life, change everything about, who you are and how you're living on a 50% chance that, something's changed from all those years you heard it growing up as a kid? So no wonder there hasn't been any engagement on their part. And, I'm sitting there thinking, well, am I going to hell because I'm identifying as transgender? Because that feels like the way I need to lean into my connection, relationship with God. That feels like how I've been created. Or am I broken? Has the fall enacted something in me that shouldn't have happened if Adam and Eve hadn't done what they did? And so, now I need to align myself with, I was born in a male body, then I should stay in a male body and, suck it up and continue to live my life like I had been for 61 years. That's when I really began to say, okay, I can't just sit in this agnostic place. I need to figure this out. And so I started reading everything that I could find on every side of this question that I could find. And one of the things that became obvious to me fairly quickly is that there were really committed, really sincere followers of Jesus who love the Bible and were coming to wildly different conclusions about what was possible, what wasn't possible. And I started to ask myself, how do I decide? There's a problem here right at the outset because I have a vested interest in the outcome. So how do I know that I'm listening well and not just simply leaning into that which enables me to choose the path of least resistance. I didn't know how I could sort that out. So what I eventually did was start looking at it from the standpoint of my sons and saying, is there a principle that I can find that can help me figure this out? And I landed on Jesus's penultimate statement of love God and love your neighbor as yourself, and started asking myself what feels most like love to my son and to others that I'm meeting in the LGBTQ community. And since I've got people on both sides making claims about what the Bible says or doesn't say, I'm going to choose to land on the side that allows me unlimited connection and support for my LGBTQ children and for others in the community. And if I've gotten this wrong, and I stand before God at some point, the one thing I can absolutely say is that, Lord, you know that what I did in service to love. If I got it wrong, I'm really sorry. But I did the best that I could to love the people in my life. And that included me. So that's kind of how I ended up in a nutshell. I mean, there's lots more to that journey, but that's the essence of it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for sharing. I can resonate with those tensions of how to love well, how to pick up our crosses and die for our neighbor, those who we care for. And there is a sweet grace of knowing that none of our efforts are perfect, so right. Like Jesus isn't pleased by the fact that we loved perfectly, but that we're working it out in faith. Where this reminds me of in my own tough situations of like how to love my neighbor well. And there's a lot of neighbors in my neighborhood who are unhoused, who struggle with addiction, or whose lives are, chaotic in the midst of that. And I'm not drawing any type of parallel here, but just thinking about the difficulty of like, oh, how do I love them well right now? And I think you use that language around like loving yourself. I'm like, or am I enabling myself or am I loving myself? And there's just so much of uncertainty in those situations. And I just resonate with that feeling of desperately trying to do your best and being very uncertain at times with like, is this loving them well or is this enabling something, and what's allowing me to move closer into relationship with them, and where,
I've been reflecting a lot on the parable of the lost son, and some of the ways in which that the father interacts with both of his children in that story. And one of the really dramatic things for me is when the younger son comes back and legitimately shows up and says, I haven't behaved well. I've squandered what you gave me. There's been a lot of decisions that I've made that haven't been good. And it's pretty clear that that's not at all what the father cares about. The father cares about one thing: the lost son is found. And I was thinking about that concept of lostness and how it has kind of two different connotations. There is a lostness which is more of an aloneness, of being out there somewhere, not knowing where you are and other people not knowing where you are. And, that fear of what is happening to this person that I care about because they're lost. And when that person finally shows up, nothing else matters. Not what happened to them, not what they've done. It is, oh my gosh, the person that I've longed to see is finally found. That lost person is found. I think the way that I, for the longest time, looked at that parable is I looked at lostness as blindness, as wrongness. And so I'm out there lost in a kind of a mindset of not knowing what I'm doing and, leaning into sin. Not me, the son is, and so when the son comes back, the foundness then is, he's going to abandon all of these things, which it does appear that's what he's planning to do. But it's definitely not what is on the forefront of the father's mind when he comes back. There is celebration. We're going to have a party. And then comes the elder brother who steps up and says, I don't get this. I've been following the rules my whole life. I've actually been like a slave to you. I've been so obedient to all of the things that I thought you wanted. And it's almost as if the father looks at the son and says, do you still not know me? Do you still not understand what's important to me? Everything I have has always been yours. We could have had this party any time. All I want is connection with you. It was never about you being my slave. It was never about you being perfectly obedient to me. It was always about you being connected to me. That's been a huge shift in the way that I am viewing my relationship with God, but not only my relationship with God, my relationship with my children, with the people who are in my life, the people that I come across on a day-to-day basis. It's like, I don't need to be worried about what's going on or not going on in your life. That is not what this human experience is about. It's about running across people who look at you and say, you matter. You are absolutely important. There is value in your life. And I trust you. Try to figure out how you can live out that value. And I'm here to support you. And I'm not going to read you a list of do's and don'ts or, pull out my Bible and quote all of the reasons why you ought to be doing this instead of that. I'm simply going to be curious about your life and let you know that in this moment, you're the only person that matters to me. And I want you to know that. It's been enormously freeing. Because remember, I came from a pastoral position where I thought that was my job every week, to get up and explain to people how they should be living, how they should not be living, and kind of being vigilant for anybody who was maybe getting off the rails a little bit, try to rein them back in again. Because I got to get you to heaven. That's my job. I don't think that's my job anymore. I think my job is to show up and give people an encounter with someone who absolutely cares about them, that if I had it within my capacity to help, as Jesus so unlimitedly had, or he could just walk into a group of people and say, oh, you're hungry, let me feed you. Oh, you're sick, let me heal you. Oh, you're not sure whether you belong, let me come have dinner at your house. Oh, you think that the entire community is rejecting you because you've got this issue of blood. Let me heal you and let me praise you in front of this entire group. That's the kind of thing that I see Jesus doing. And when I started looking for that in the pages of Scripture, I discovered it's all over the place. And I'd never really seen it. It was incredible to me that I spent 32 years poring over the Bible. I have my Bibles with the really big margins, and there's not a single margin that doesn't have some writing, some note, some way I'm trying to interact with the Scriptures. And gosh, I missed some of the biggest things that are present there. And, the biggest one of all, love your neighbor as yourself, because all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
Can I?
Yeah, jump in.
Sorry.
I can talk forever. You'll never get a word in edgewise.
I've been reading through the Gospel of Luke slowly with my neighborhood Bible study, and I've been hit by some of the same, just repeated what you bring up in the parable of the lost son about the banquet. There's so many parables where Jesus is talking about who's being invited to the banquet, who's being invited to the meal. When you yourself throw a meal, who are you inviting to it? Are you inviting those who can repay the favor, or are you inviting those who wouldn't be able to, those who are often excluded from these social circles? And there's one, I don't remember where it is, and if it might be even in a different gospel, but I just was reading in Luke, the gospel of the wedding feast, where you have all these people who are like, oh, I'm too busy, I'm not going to the wedding feast. And so the person says, well, go out to the highways and byways. We need to have a party here. We need to invite everybody in. And those who thought that they deserved to be there or were too good to be there are actually the ones who end up being excluded. And so there's this great reversal. But I think, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, there's one of the tellings of that parable where there's a guest who comes to the wedding feast and doesn't use the wedding garments that were provided.
Right.
And there's this kind of notion of a semi-conditional welcome. It's like, oh, everybody's welcome here. And that is what the party's all about, is saying everyone who's been excluded is brought in. But there's a way that you can spurn that welcome, even though you're present. And the biggest way that's emphasized in the Gospels is this kind of what we often call the Pharisaical legalist.
Right.
How you describe a lot of your ministry of just got to hold the line, got to live up to this. But I'm wondering if you have experiences of people who you've been so excited to see, you've welcomed them in with open arms, maybe to your very dinner table, and then in some sort of way, there was something that you had to say, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable here. And in a way that just complicates this dynamic of I so want you here, but there's sometimes tension, or sometimes people call it boundaries.
Yeah. Let me take a step away from that question for just a bit before I come back to it, and talk about a way that I am responding to the Bible that is different than what I used to, that informs my answer to the question.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
So 9 different times in Scripture, in one form or another, the statement is made that loving your neighbor as yourself fulfills all of the law and the prophets. It's all throughout the Gospels. Every one of the Gospel writers says it in some way or another. Paul says it a couple of times. Peter says it. James says it. James surprised me because he calls it the law of liberty. And I thought that's an interesting phrasing, law of liberty. What law gives liberty? But the law of loving your neighbor as yourself is the law of liberty in James 2:9. And so the particular passage that really resonates for me of those 9 is when Jesus said, all of love your neighbor as yourself, because all of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. And the image that I picture with that is like a baby's mobile, where it's hanging over the top of the crib. And then we as parents might come along and hang other things on that mobile that we think will be interesting and attractive to the child. And I now look at the Scriptures as, if I'm reading something, like this parable that you just described, where you've got someone showing up with wedding garments or the wrong garments, and is then excluded because of that. And here I am, 2,000 years removed from whatever the custom and story that's trying to communicate. So I can't totally be sure what the message was there. I asked myself the question, how does that hang from this mobile? And there are a lot of passages of scripture where I don't know how they hang. When I read passages about slavery, when I read some of the exclusionary passages, even in the New Testament, where, either Paul or sometimes even Jesus is dividing people into this group or that group and so on. And I'm not exactly sure how they hang from love your neighbor as yourself. What I do know is that they're all supposed to hang. And so rather than trying to go through some kind of mental gymnastics to try to figure out a way to make them hang, I choose instead to look at them with what I call mystery and say, I don't understand how this hangs at this moment. I'm not saying it doesn't. What I'm saying is I don't know. There may be 4 or 5 or 10 people who will go to that passage of scripture and say, well, this is how I think it hangs. And every one of them is exercising kind of this internal ability to trust the leading of the Spirit for how they're going to live their lives. And that's what I offer myself and other people now is actually trust you to figure out what it is, how that hangs from that command.
Mm-hmm.
And if you reach a different conclusion than I do, I will support you. Whatever you need for me to do to help you live out your commitment to follow Christ, you can count on my support. That doesn't mean that I'm going to do it exactly the same way. It doesn't mean that if when I reach a conclusion about something that I'm expecting that you need to do that. Rather, I really do trust that the Spirit is at work in all of our lives and that we're each trying our very best to follow God with the conscience and the understanding that we have. That may evolve over time, but I just don't feel any responsibility anymore to say you're doing it wrong or even that you're doing it right. I keep asking the question, the other passage, one of the other passages, Romans 13:8 says, love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And that's the only question I really ever ask myself anymore. Is what you're doing causing someone else harm? Or is it causing you harm? And if it is, maybe we should rethink. I would just invite you to rethink whether or not the posture you're taking is actually in alignment with God's expectations. So, that comes out of a really momentous experience that I had with Matthew chapter 7 one day. Let me just pause for a second and see if there's anything else you want to ask or respond. Like I said, I can keep talking forever.
I am interested in hearing, I just love hearing how people interact with the scriptures. And I thank you for what I really resonate with what you're emphasizing there in the scriptures is one, hanging everything on the first commandments of love. And so that you have an integrated way of following God in this world. And I have noticed there is sometimes an immaturity that we continue to encourage in the church when we try to give people to live by overly narrow, like do and don'ts proof texting with scriptures that people were like, oh, you're being a good biblical Christian. And you're actually kind of giving them a immature way of engaging the scriptures and not engaging in the very contextual call to love and to apply the wisdom of the scriptures and to honor God. And I do have maybe a follow-up question, but if you want to first share about Matthew 7.
Sure. So I'm trans. I have 2 gay sons. So there's a lot of intersection there. I understand what it's like to be a parent of a gay child. I also understand what it's like to be part of the queer community and all of the fear of what's going to happen to my relationships if I actually show up and tell people what's going on for me. So I very quickly kind of got involved in helping other parents navigate their relationship with their children and trying to help them avoid some of the pitfalls, really bad pitfalls that, we had in my relationship with my children. And, basically saying, okay, you've got your theology and you've got your love for your child. It's actually okay if you process your theology apart from your child. And, let's go ahead and lean into what loving your child is all about. And you can talk through the theology, figure out what how you're going to respond, what you believe. But if you're going to wait till you have all of those questions answered before you show up in your child's life, that's devastating for your kid. So try to give parents permission to process both at the same time. So I'm thinking about, Matthew 7, which is the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is out there on that countryside. And it's not like this is a Sunday morning sermon. This is like the prophet came to town. He's going to be here for 1 week, and then he's moving on to other locations. And so essentially, he has one shot at giving you something to guide your life and enable you to walk with God. Because he doesn't get the chance to be the pastor, and follow this up with, can I come and talk to you? Those kinds of questions. So I'm sitting here listening to him talk, and I'm trying to imagine, what if I'm a parent and I'm sitting there and I know something's going on with my child? Something's out of kilter. They're not processing relationships the same way that most other kids do. There certainly wasn't language around being gay, being homosexual, or being trans, or any of that. So there's no way they have language in their minds to be able to put that into words. But that doesn't mean that as parents, they don't know that or potentially know that something's going on. And even if they don't, because a lot of kids don't tell their parents, I'm imagining the kids sitting there thinking, gosh, something's going on with me that's different from most of my friends. And I don't know if you've ever gone to a church service or opened the Bible and said, I need to hear something. I need to hear from God. I just don't know what to do. Well, that's what it feels like was happening on the side of that hill that day. And I'll try to keep this short. I'll skip. There's so much in that whole chapter, but specifically starting in verse 9, Jesus starts talking to parents. And he says, if your child asks you for bread, will you give them a stone? If they ask you for a fish, will you give them a snake? The answer is clear. You're going to give them bread. You're going to give them a fish. Parents instinctively know, and there's always exceptions to broad statements, but parents instinctively know when they're giving their kids bread and when they are giving their kids rocks. I gave my son rocks. I knew I was giving him rocks at the time, but I didn't have any framework for being able to say, this is a rock. I am literally harming my child by giving it to him. Mm-hmm. And I knew it. I could feel it. I could watch it happening in front of me, but I didn't know what else to do. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting there trying to imagine that I'm hearing these words from Jesus for the very first time. So I don't have two 2 millennia of commentary on these verses. I haven't preached on them 10 times already. I've never heard this before. And I'm starting to realize that Jesus is telling parents to trust themselves, to trust their instincts about giving their kids bread or giving their kids stones. And he really drives it home in the next thing he says when he says, if you know how to give good gifts to your kids, even though you are evil, even though you aren't perfect, even though you could point to the many times you've failed your kids, you still know. Well, if you're like that, how much more your Father in heaven? Essentially saying, where did you get this instinct from? Well, you got it from your heavenly parents. You can trust this about yourself. That was mind-blowing to me, the way in which Jesus was telling parents they could trust themselves in the way they were raising their kids. I mean, there are a lot of people out there in this space who are constantly telling parents what they should or should not do with their LGBTQ child. And if they were sitting on the side of the hill that day listening to Jesus, pretty sure they would have walked away saying, to heck with the rest of you people. This is my child. I'm going to give them bread. And I'm going to give it to them because that instinct comes from my Father in heaven. And if that wasn't enough, the very next verse, the very next thing that Jesus says is based on all of that, what I just told you about parenting and how you can trust your kids and how that comes from your parent in heaven. This is what I want to leave with you so that you will be able to make good decisions even if you never see me again. He says, so whatever you would have others do for you, do for them. Because this fulfills all of the law and the prophets. And again, my mind is blown. I'm thinking, did I just hear that right? Did I just hear Jesus say, I don't need a Pharisee to tell me what to do? I don't need a priest. I don't need a religious leader to tell me how to live my life. Did I just hear him say that? Did I just hear him say that even if I don't know the individual tenets of Scripture, that I can still get this right by simply asking what I would want others to do for me and doing that for them, and I will in that process be fulfilling all of the things that God has ever written, even if I don't know what they are? It's no wonder the Pharisees wanted to kill him. I mean, basically just said, we don't need you anymore. That was the transformative moment for me where I really saw Jesus putting a lot of trust in imperfect people to figure out their relationship with God, their relationship with people, their relationship with their children. And unless Jesus is just speaking, platitudes in that moment and doesn't really believe any of this is possible, which then would discredit him in my eyes. Here he is giving them practical instruction about how to live their lives when he's gone. And mind you, this is before he's gone to the cross. It's before the Spirit has been given, and yet he still believes in that internal goodness that comes from the Imago Dei in all of us. And that despite our failures, despite the ways we make bad decisions from time to time, it doesn't invalidate our ability to tell the difference between bread and stones, or to have the ability to put ourselves in another person's shoes, so to speak, and treat them the way we'd want to be treated. So that was the turning point for me of not only the way I'm seeing my relationship with God and being able to trust that I really am trying to love people. And I ask that question all the time. When I don't know what to do, I constantly asking that question. Well, what would I want done for me if I was in that situation?
Yeah.
And trying to live my life that way. And so, and then I look at you, or you, TJ, and I say, well, you're no different than I am. You have a connection with God. You can figure this out. I don't have to tell you what to do. I just have to support you as you try to figure this thing out. And, I'll tell you what's happening for me, and I'll do my best to live it out. And you tell me what's happening for you. And maybe we're doing it completely different ways, but I'm not going to tell you you're not doing it right. This is a journey for all of us. And the whole point is connection with God. So that's what
I can really appreciate, coming from the evangelical tradition, I think some of that latent Gnosticism that has infected a lot of evangelicalism has even more done that distancing away from like, what role does the Spirit working through our gut, through, what we're feeling, how does that play into us bearing out this imago Dei to our obedience, and not merely relying upon rational truths. And both to you and potentially to listeners, just or clarification, when I brought up the wedding guest who refused the wedding clothes, I was thinking of that more abstractly. I don't want anyone to hear that I was specifically trying to say, that's trans people who aren't welcome at the table because they didn't put on the right expression of clothes or anything. So I just wanted to make sure I was thinking of other unrelated topics in my head. But on this topic of transness, talk about loving your neighbor as yourself, and what would you do unto them? Living in community with people who are very different than me, there's also the recognizing that I don't there's, whether it's love languages or personalities, sometimes what's most loving to me, isn't exactly map onto the other person. And there's something of listening to the other person and actually understanding them. And so to that end, just want to understand you and your experience more, because so that I know how to, and our listeners as well, how to love our trans friends well. And I think one way, TJ, I'll maybe pass it off to you in this, like, love rejoices with the truth. And one of the things of just like, what are the truths around embodiment? TJ, do you want to speak on that a little bit more? And we'd love to just hear how you've related to that, Grace, and learn more about your experiences with gender.
My first thing I was going to say, hearing you talk, and I'm going to turn this to the sexuality conversation more than the trans conversation. It just reminds me, we have sub levels of how we interpret what love is, and how we interpret how love functions, and what the boundaries are of love, how love relates to other things, and even what Jesus was doing in the text that we have, and what that message might have meant to his listeners, what tradition he was operating from, how he related to the Pharisees. We might agree on some things, but I also see these sub, if you think of geology, there's the thing that appears in the ground level. There's a lot of substrata underneath. And when I hear you talk, I often say oh my goodness, we might agree on this thing that appears on the ground level, but the substrata of our concepts of how we think about the world are pretty different. Even in some ways, my history, my experience, I guess led me to a different position on sexuality, but also kind of led me to a different way of engaging what I thought Jesus was doing in the text and his ministry in some ways in relation to love. Because for me, I always thought this is made more similar to the Pentecostal days that you were mentioning when you were a Pentecostal pastor. I always thought the greatest love was God reaching down to human beings to be united with them. And as part of that, being able to transform them to his likeness. And that's the growth of holiness. And without that, yeah, like, would I want to follow God if he's not gonna like bring me into that unity with him and that kind of making him more like him? Like, I don't know. But I think that transformative nature that I see, that turning to him more and more like God, which doesn't always look like what human beings think. Let's lay that down. Human beings think lots of things. Doesn't always look like that. And I think God has more possibilities with holiness than like some people might anticipate, right? But yeah, that just makes me more willing to want to think that God is like God wants us to walk in certain paths rather than other paths, and willing to talk in those terms to the people that I'm around sometimes, and even in my own life. I don't have a lot of control over other people, obviously, but I have more agency in my own life. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to just see that, like, again, these substratum differences that kind of make us produce different ideas of how we should engage the world, what's good, how you relate to others. Yeah.
And it overlaps a little bit with our previous conversation, TJ, about Jonathan Haidt's work, about the moral. Grace, have you heard of Jonathan Haidt and his moral framework theory at all?
I have.
Yeah.
Yes, I've read the book.
So I hear you really leaning into the care harm moral reference point. And anyways, I just thought of that a little bit.
Yeah, that seems right. We mentioned this a little bit in some past conversations, Grace, about embodiment. And it kind of came up because you've asked me a few times when we met, what does side B think about the trans topics? And I say, side B does not have a unified perspective. There's a lot of different kind of side B theology. Side B people have different theologies around trans topics. But in my opinion, embodiment, which, I mean, you might think about this idea that, like, the human body is an essential part of the human beings and their earthly experience. It's an essential part of the human person in the age to come. The body is not just something we occupy as if you can just separate soul and body, but it's in fact like an integral part of who we are and who I am. And like this human being is like both spirit and body in some integrative fashion. And somehow it's like shaping the nature of the body guides our ethical and moral reflection around ourselves and humanity generally. Like that idea of embodiment or something like that plays a pretty strong part in the side B sexual ethic around sexuality. Mm-hmm. And it starts shading in, I think it often shades in for trans topics, but at least in the side B movement as it stands now, it's not necessarily like a cohesive understanding of what it all relates to. So anyways, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if you have them, but that's kind of I don't know, it's not a problem, but it's like
you've raised a lot there, TJ.
I know, there's a lot.
Conversations about that all afternoon, couldn't we?
I know we could. It's complicated, but I'd love to hear any thoughts you have.
Things related to, I mean, there's a fundamental shift for me in the way that I look at people. I know I was raised to believe in a sin nature and separation from God because of that. I don't believe that anymore. I look at us as made in the image of God, and we go through life, experience traumas, and a lot of that nature gets scarred over, and we end up behaving in ways that are harmful to ourselves and to others. Mm-hmm. I don't happen to think that God is disgusted with us. I don't think he has any trouble whatsoever hanging out with us in whatever condition we're in. I mean, Jesus is proof of that. So the idea that God is somehow untouchable, pristine, can't embrace kind of this evilness about us doesn't ring true for me anymore. Mm-hmm. And because of that, it changes the way I look at you. It changes the way I look at everyone around me. It changes the way I look at that person who comes into the banquet and doesn't have the right clothes on. I look at them and I think, there's a reason why this feels like the best way to show up at my house today. I don't know what that reason is, but I bet if I did know what that reason was, I could have more compassion for you. Maybe I would set a boundary around that, but if I did, it would only be because I don't want you harming me or my family, or I don't want you harming yourself, but it's not because I'm telling you you need to do something that aligns with what, I expect you to do. What I really want you to know is that I'm really glad you showed up. It matters to me that you're here. I care about why you think you need to wear these clothes when really probably you should be wearing these ones. At least that would be more relationally correct somehow. I don't know how, because I'm not part of that culture, but that's kind of the way I look at people now is, okay, maybe you're saying some really mean things, or you're being hateful, or you're harming me, or you're saying bad things about me. That doesn't make you bad. That doesn't even mean you're bad at core. It means that you've been hurt. And this makes the best sense to you right now. So if we could kind of help make sense of that, maybe that divine nature that's in you might have a chance to shine out a little bit more. So, I see God as ready and willing to embrace all of us and help us to find that healing, to be reminded of who we are at our core. So there is the transformation element to that, but it's a very intimate one of God showing up and is sitting on our bench while we're in the midst, while we're messy and, and things are not going well, and maybe we could have done things differently and so on. But that it's kind of like what happened in the garden. I mean, they messed up, and does God, kick them out and spank them and say, I'm so mad at you, I can't even look at you right now? No. He's with them the entire time. He sits down with them. He clothes them. He can't understand why they're afraid of him. What did I do? That just kind of points me back to the fact that, there wasn't really a substantive change that happened before the fruit and after the fruit. There were challenges in that relationship that existed already, and things that they didn't understand about God's posture toward them. And then when they get outside the garden, God's still right there. And he's still talking to Cain as he's thinking about killing his brother Abel and saying, you don't have to do this. It's an option, of course, but you don't have to do this. He's essentially reaffirming the fact that, I'm here, I'm with you. We can do this a different way. You're not horribly messed up in such a way that this is inevitable. Anyway, that again, just when I look at the way it changes the way I relate to people, it hangs a lot better from the second command. And so
it's more like integrative position the way you think about it.
Yeah. As to trans experience, go for it.
I'm like, you keep bringing up biblical things, and it's like, how do you relate to this arc in Judges or Joshua? But yes, I'd love to hear specifically. You mentioned before when we talked about 3 levels of gender experience. So whether that processing has been more recent or before, would just love to hear and learn from how you're thinking about this.
Can I ask a related question that's so related?
Sure.
I mean, I'd love to hear. What does trans experience mean to you when you say that? And then also, because I think, what does that mean is when you say that?
Let me see if I can give some windows into this very difficult experience
I bet.
to describe. I mean, that's one of the things you hear most often, or I hear most often is, gosh, I don't understand. I don't get it. It's like, how or what, and I'm not always able to clearly define that. It's like if I were to ask you, how do you know that you are a male?
I totally get that. I totally get that.
If you wanted to try, you're stuck trying to give empirical evidence, like, well, let me show you some body parts, and that helps, or I've got some hair that grows on my face. Women don't do that. All of these external markers, but.
When I was young, I had gender dysphoria, I guess. So, and I've some of my readings say that sometimes people who are reading out like LGBT people, queer people, whatever, sometimes have gender dysphoric experiences when they're young.
Yes,
but for me, it
yes.
resolved over time. But I kind of remember what that
Yep.
it's like. You know what I mean? Like it was like feeling like I was a young girl. But then for me, it resolved, and I felt comfortable being a man. But I'm saying I assume that's part of what the trans experience is like, but I could be wrong. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. So please continue. Sorry.
So one of the passages that I love most in Scripture is Psalm 139. David's kind of talking about the way that God has crafted him. And I think that a New International Revised Version says, "Oh God, you are so amazing and wonderful in the way that you made me. I am so grateful." I've had that passage used against me, in the sense of, God made you wonderful and he made you perfect. And now here you are kind of throwing that in his face, like, you have boy parts. Why are you disregarding this way that God has made you so perfectly and wonderfully? And I look at that passage, Psalm 139, and I ask myself, what's it really talking about there? Because it talks David when he's talking. Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge the fact that technically only David gets to apply this psalm to himself. It was a message between him and God, is how he was feeling one day. I'm appropriating that. There is no valid justification for any of us saying that applies to us. But I read it as I read many passages of Scripture, and I feel resonance. I feel that lifting of my spirit. I feel like I think that's really true for all of us. And then when I look at what it is that David is looking at, he says, well, you formed my inmost being. He talks about God seeing his unformed body, no gender yet. And we all know that every one of us start out female to begin with, but that's a scientific fact that David couldn't possibly have been aware of. But as far as he was saying, God saw his unformed body. And the one part that might be a physical feature, the frame or the bones, as NIRV says, is also an internal piece that's not visible. And then he goes on to talk about, and all of the days that were ordained for me were written in your book before even one of them came to pass. Kind of this recognition that we all have purpose, we all have meaning, we all have good works that we were prepared in advance to do. There's a reason why we're on this planet. And so nothing about that psalm has anything to do with physical characteristics of male or female. And to use the psalm in that way feels like an egregious misuse, when in fact David was celebrating that the essence of who he is, that inmost being that God created, that he saw at conception, that's the beautiful and wonderful. And David is fully convinced that, yeah, I'm really wonderful. I look at that passage and I feel the resonance that I have with God in the way in which my life has so dramatically changed and leaned in the direction of loving my neighbor, of loving myself, of the ways in which that I am no longer hiding as I did for the first 60 years of my life. I was terrified of abandonment. I thought all I had to do was just do one wrong thing and people would walk away. I was afraid that if I said or did the wrong thing as a pastor, that people would leave the church and maybe they might even stop following God. And so a lot of what motivated my life was this fear of getting it wrong. And it looked like love on the outside, because it always translated into, yes, I'll do whatever it is you need or want me to do, because I don't want you to abandon me and I don't want you to abandon God. And then I reached this place one day of realizing, gosh, in my inmost being, whatever that is, I don't know how to describe that, I have this sense that I'm a girl. I don't know how to explain how I have this sense. That's just how I see myself. And when I think about interacting with God, that feels more in line with the way they made me. So when I read Psalm 139, I read it as a call to be, a call to give expression to all that I sense is within me. And instead of denying that that exists or saying, well, you know what, I have male parts, so I'm therefore obligated to live and breathe and function in the world as a male, that just doesn't fit. But being female does. And I don't know how to describe it other than somewhere deep inside, that feels like how God made me. And like my best expression of Psalm 139 is to live into the fact that I'm a transgender woman. I'm not saying that I'm a cisgender woman, cis meaning that I was born with female parts. I'm saying that I'm a transgender woman. That's different, but it is something. And there's evidence of us and also trans men all over the world in every culture and every religion for as long as anybody has been keeping records.
Yeah.
So in some places it's celebrated.
Mm-hmm. True.
In our culture with our Western Christian background, it's not.
Yeah.
But when I think about my relationship with God, it's like I feel called to lean into the way that God made me.
And
that's one level of.
Oh, sorry. Continue. Sorry.
It feels to me like if I said, "Oh, I'm not really feeling female. I'm not. This doesn't really, because I have male parts." Right. That I really should, in order to honor God, I should live a different way, take different roles, respond, in different ways. That feels like a violation of the way in which God made me. That's the only thing, that's the only way I can describe it. It's like I feel aligned with God when I show up in the world as grace.
Okay.
That's one level of gender. I think we see that in Scripture. We see the eunuch, primarily in the area of eunuchs, that's about the only place where you see sexual and gender minorities in Scripture. Yes, they're generally presenting as male, as we would understand male, but they're different. Jesus talked about the eunuch that was born that way. And there's no indication that Jesus ever corrected anyone's way they were born, their gender or sexuality. It didn't. And the first convert from the Gentiles is this eunuch, another sexual and gender minority, whom there's actually no conversation about what's expected of him other than, do you believe in Jesus and do you want to follow him? And he's absolutely all over that. And he's baptized and goes on about his business with nary a word about how he's supposed to conduct himself, even though he's in this space that almost nobody else occupies. And, I think it was Megan DeFranca who said that in all of the healings that Jesus did, never once did he heal someone from a gender or sexual issue. There's no mention of that. I don't know what that means. It's an argument from something that didn't happen. So it might not mean anything, but at the very least, there is this acceptance that the male-female binary is not all there is. It's not. It's just mentioned. And then, today we know that if you look at human beings at the chromosomal level, I think there are 20 plus variations of intersex conditions somewhere that don't fit the binary of XX and XY, and each one has kind of unique impacts on the body. We look at the Genesis story and it's all a series of binaries, and yet we all know that there's variation between the binaries. We don't say that there's no such thing as dusk or dawn because all there is night and day. I get it that when you look around at the world that exists, we don't have the ability to look at chromosomes. All we can do is look at external bodies. And so it looks like all there is binary. But at the level that God sees, that's variation. And maybe not extensive variation. Not a lot of transgender people in the world. But we are here. And we seem to keep coming. And
yeah, true.
and so I have just come to accept that this is how God made me and the best way that I can live in obedience to God. And I don't even like the word obedience because that's what he's about. I think he's about connection. The best way I can stay closely connected to God is by living into this way, this body that he created for me. You mentioned that I had talked about two other concepts of gender that I experience, and one of those is more social or cultural. I realized that I have no idea what it means. I have this internal sense that I'm female, but I have no idea how to do that. I always thought I could. And then I realized, gosh, I don't think that's who I actually am. And so if I'm going to show up in the world that way, and again, this is just me. Not everybody feels this need to be male, as much as female as I could be. But how do I show up in the world? The only way I know how to do it is by what I observed from the two women in my life that I have the most connection with, which is my wife and my daughter. So everything that I do, for initially is, this is what I think I should be doing based on what I've seen modeled for me, which means that I'm likely to get it really wrong at times. And I don't know if I told you the story going into the auto parts store, and, I've repaired cars all of my life. That's how we survived. So we didn't have all these, repair bills. And my wife's car, the alternator went out on it one day, and this is shortly after I transitioned to be fully living as Grace, and she asked if I'd be willing to fix it. And I said, of course. Yeah, I'd love to do that. So I walked into the auto parts store, and this is the part that I don't even know how this happened. But I walked into the auto parts store, and I didn't realize I was doing this until later when I reflected back on the whole experience. And I walked in there kind of like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you help me figure out what alternator to buy? How do I do this? This kind of this ditzy, like, why am I acting like I don't know what I'm doing when I know exactly what I'm doing? I took it, I went home, I replaced the alternator, I brought it back to get it tested to make sure everything was fine. And, they're testing it, and I say, I'm so proud of myself. I was able to replace this alternator. Like, that was the craziest thing in the world, that I, a woman, should be able to change an alternator. I'm driving away from the auto parts store, and about a half mile away, it just floods over me. It's like, what just happened to me? Why did I behave that way? Where did that come from? It wasn't like I was consciously trying to behave in a particular way. And I realized, oh my gosh, that's my male socialization telling me what it thinks a female should do or be in that particular setting. And I thought, oh my gosh, how many times have I betrayed the female gender by, trying to live out this feminine life from a male point of view. And, that's where I'm so very deeply grateful for the number of cis women that are close personal friends of mine, because they put up with this. They allow me to talk to them and really understand what their experience is of being a woman, and I get to learn things that were never possible for me to learn, and wouldn't be if they weren't in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another level of experiencing gender, kind of a mental overhead that I carry with me all the time, just trying to show up in what feels like an authentic way to me, realizing I don't even know how to do this. It's a work in progress. I'm 3 years old at this at most. So I'm a toddler. I'm going to make a lot of dumb mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the last piece, which is another embodiment piece. And that is, I really do enjoy being perceived as female.
Mm-hmm.
And not every male to female transgender person has that privilege. I, for whatever reason, happen to have features that, with a little bit of makeup and the right clothes and the right hair, I can get away with.
Mm-hmm.
I can show up and most people will give me the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that because it gives me a chance to actually connect with someone before they make a judgment about me. And then that gives me the chance to, if the conversation is right, to actually talk about the fact that I'm trans and hopefully change the narrative a little bit about, what people think about who trans people are.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes very important to me to be able to, again, this is just me. Not every trans person feels this way, but this is, for me, it's important for me to pass, so to speak. And so I'm willing to consider, different, I've taken hormones because that helps for me to pass.
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to consider various surgeries, most facial in particular, because that's the place where most people recognize that I'm not actually a cisgender natal female.
Mm-hmm.
And so that becomes important to me. But one of the things that I needed to get to before I could consider any of that is I have to be okay with the fact that I am a transgender woman, not a cisgender one. I can't be out there trying to pursue this vision of being a perfectly passing woman. It could be in some ways a bit like, a person with an eating disorder who is constantly striving for a weight that it's never enough. And I realized that if I couldn't be okay with the body that I have, because I live in a place of privilege these days where there are actually things I can do to align my body to look more female. In the time of Jesus, that was not possible. You got what you got. And you had to live out, your experience the best you could.
Mm-hmm.
And
True.
so I recognize that if I'm not able to be okay with being in the body that I have and trying to show up in the world as a female, then I'm probably not ready to do any changes to my body, because I might actually end up getting into a never-ending cycle of it's never enough.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my 3 experiences of what it means to experience gender in the world.
Thank you for naming those.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are, in these conversations around transgender experience in life, what do you think are some important things to consider in the conversation as it's moving forward? What are important aspects that you would want people to be thinking about in this conversation now or into the near future? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what I would say is be curious. Don't be judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
Take the time to get to know someone before you decide things about them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I try to show up, with curiosity. I want people to know they matter to me.
Mm-hmm.
And there's such misinformation being presented about what it means to be trans. Technically, at the federal level, I don't exist. There's no such thing as trans people. Well, here I am. I'm not going away. I'm not going to sit down. I'm not going to hide. I'm also not going to be belligerent and angry and in your face, and I'm not going to wring my hands, and I'm not going to think how terrible things are. I realize, and we were talking about this before we started the recording. I realize that no executive order can stop me from loving my neighbor. That's what I was doing before the current administration came into power. That's what I plan to do until Jesus comes back or I die. No one can stop me from doing that. They might make it more difficult for me to live my life. I might have to worry about what bathroom I can go in without being arrested or being accused of wanting to assault someone. I might not be able to have my care covered anymore by Medicare because that's where I am at this stage in life. Somebody might decide that it's time to take away my identity documents and roll them back to what they used to be, and all of that will make my life so much more difficult. But none of it stops me from loving my neighbor, including the people who are wanting to do this to me. And so for me, I can't overcome the federal government. I'm not in any place to change the legislation happening in South Carolina or anywhere else. But I have a sphere of influence. And I can love people, and if I can move the needle toward love in my little sphere of influence, then that's the resistance that I want to offer in this current season. I think that's what Jesus called us to do, is to bring heaven on earth. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's what I'm here to do. And when I look around today, there's a lot of people trying to make life more difficult, but I also look around and I watch God tap people on the shoulder all the time and encourage them to love their neighbor, to still stand up for a marginalized person, to pick up a cross and be willing to suffer on behalf of someone else. And when I'm tempted to get discouraged, I just look around and see the number of people that are saying, no, this isn't right. I don't have to be mad and angry and get mean about it. I'm just going to love my neighbor. I'm going to let them know they matter to me. That's what I'm trying to do. And we'll let the rest take care of itself.
Grace, do you have any other final thoughts you want to share about any of this conversation that we've had or something similar?
I really do think that Jesus' command to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves really sums up the way I'm trying to live my life. I don't have much figured out, but when I'm confused about how to respond to someone, that's my go-to. And I guess I would say one more thing about that. There is a sense in some corners that you love another person by insisting that they behave a certain way because that's God's way, and that's obviously has to be the most loving thing. I see Jesus blowing that up when he says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, where he's saying you really do need to ask the other person what feels like love to them and give that to them. That's what love is. And so when I'm out there trying to love my neighbor, it really begins with curiosity and trying to understand, where are you? What do you need? And is there something in my makeup experience, my pocketbook, whatever, that could meet a need that you're having right now and cause you to walk away and feel like, wow, Grace loves me. That's why I'm here.
Thank you for that thought. Also, do you have any way that people could connect with you if they were interested? Maybe social media, for example, or something else?
I'm really bad at social media.
Okay,
So
yeah.
if you want to reach out to me, my email address is probably the best. And
Okay, we'll share that in the show notes. Is that okay?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Thank you again, Grace, for this opportunity for us. There's a certain vulnerability in letting other people share their curiosities and ask questions and being able to share with that. So thank you. And
Thank you, David.
yeah, I hope
Thank
this
you,
isn't the last
teachers.
time that our paths cross.
No,
Let's
no.
talk again someday.
I love these conversations. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, listeners, for joining. God bless all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Friends, I want to tell you about Revoice Conference this summer. And yes, if we haven't met yet, maybe we're not quite friends yet, but I assume if you come to Revoice, then we will meet, and then we can be friends. I have had the joy of being at every Revoice conference, so this is an easy plug for me to invite you into. If you haven't been, or if you've been before, come out to Seattle early July 9th through 12th, and join for a few days of just lovely time together, worship, listening to great speakers, going out to different breakout workshops on not just fascinating, but just, important topics that become really practical, whether you yourself are just trying to figure out, how do I live a flourishing life with God in the midst of my sexuality? Or you want to know, how can I be a good friend, a good partner in a church, and support the queer SSA community? We have a really terrific lineup of speakers. Dr. Wesley Hill is returning, arts speaking. Our friend Mwendia, who we've interviewed before, is also coming across the ocean to join us. Julia Sadusky, who I would love to get on our podcast at some point. And I'm really excited. If you haven't registered, check out the link in the show notes and do what you can to make it out there. Bring a friend with you. Or if you really can't come there physically, there are some online registration options as well. I know people have appreciated, and they're looking to make those engaging. In fact, Elaine and I will be doing a panel on the stage that will be live streamed around community living. And TJ will be doing a not live streamed panel on Kinship 101, how to actually think about all the different ways that we build kinship. So Lord willing, it'd be great to see you there.